Now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this Make Business webinar in partnership with She Software. We have a great session for you this morning as we look into how to engage a multi-generational workforce. I'm Jenny and I will be your moderator for the session. This webinar is being recorded, so will be available for you to watch on demand. We have some other time allocated at the end for questions, so please do submit any questions you do have by using the chat box at any point, and we'll put them to our experts at the end of the session. I'm delighted to introduce our presenters. Chris Newson. Chris is the Head of Product Development and Delivery at Make Business. Chris has been working in health and safety for 15 years, is a Chartered Fellow of IOSH and sits on the IOSH panel to approve Chartered members. We also have Julian Taylor, Head of Solutions Architects at She Software. Julian is NEBOSH qualified, has worked in health and safety for 20 years. Julian works with businesses to map out technology solutions to their issues and challenges. I'm now pleased to hand over to Julian to start the session.
That's great. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for the introduction and welcome to the webinar, everybody. Here at She Software, we're fortunate to meet and to work with lots of interesting people within the health and safety and the compliance world. As a team who are solely focused on health and safety, it's great because we learn from each and every one of those meetings and interactions. We live in a world that's changing and evolving rapidly. And this accelerated evolution started in the early 80s when a few people started to buy into home computing. And we've moved to a world today where technology is just ingrained in most aspects of people's lives. This change in technology has also, in some people's eyes, exacerbated the evolving and different attitudes between generations of people. Now, if we define what we mean by generation, a generation is a group of people born around the same time, raised around the same place, and people in this birth cohort exhibit similar characteristics, preferences, and values over their lifetime. I read a quote which is important when we consider our approach to health and safety, which is generations are not in a box. Instead, what they offer are powerful clues showing where we can begin connecting with and influencing people of different ages. And a couple of really interesting facts that really help us to focus our thoughts. Firstly, more people now own a mobile phone than a toothbrush, which is quite worrying and suggests that we maybe shouldn't get too close to some people. But secondly, human beings now have a shorter attention span than a goldfish, which is quite a scary statistic. But when we think about it, we've got so many things that now vie for our attention that they end up actually distracting us. But these points need to be considered when we start to think about and start to build safety processes. We're discussing this subject because it's regularly brought up. And it relates strongly to how we engage our people with our safety, our health, and our business cultures. Just for clarification, when we think about what the different generations are, Generation Z or Centennials were born 1996 or later. Millennials or Generation Y were born between 1977 and 1995. Generation X were born between 1965 to 1976, and then we have the baby boomers who were between 1946 and 1964. Now, when we consider our workforces, as we'd expect, what we're seeing is a growing presence of millennials. Figures show that millennials are becoming the biggest generation in the workplace. And by 2025, they're going to make up 75% of our workforces. Equally, there are more people from the baby boomer generation who are actually working longer. And when we think about this, one of the key drivers of it is the economic downturn in 2008, which had a big effect on people's long-term plans through the effect it had on pensions. So it ended up forcing people to work for longer. So key part of today is considering how do we then relate this back to the things that we do within health and safety. But to start with, I'm going to hand back to Jenny, who's going to run our first poll.
Thanks, Julian. Yes, so for our first poll, we would like to see how that generational split is reflected in your workplace. So we would like you to tell us what proportion of your workforce is under the age of 30. Is it 25% or lower, between 26 and 50%, between 51 and 75%, or 75% or higher? Just give a couple more seconds to give everyone the opportunity to contribute. That's great, thank you very much. So let's have a look at what the results look like. So really interesting. So there's no one with more than 50% of their workforce under the age of 30. Most are 25% or lower, with 63%, and then with 38%, it's between a quarter and a half of the workforce. It's currently under the age of 30. So Chris, how does that reflect what you'd expect?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. It's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it shows that there is a split in terms of different generations that Julian's talking about, which we I guess probably knew that, but it's good to check the people on the webinar that we need to think about these different generations. I think that is indicative of most workplaces, certainly in the manufacturing sector. So it's really useful for us then, knowing that, to then talk about how the different generations perhaps feel about health and safety. So I just thought it'd be useful to talk about the 4 generations, building on what Julian said, and talk about some of our experiences. So we start with the baby boomers. So this generation, as Julian's already mentioned, strong work ethic. There's a competitive nature there. We found really just interesting examples here that in terms of training courses, this generation relate quite well to simple games. You might call it gamification, but if anyone on the webinar has seen any of the new or recent IOSH materials, whether it's working safely, managing safely, whatever it might be, they've all got an element of gamification, just simple things, jigsaws that you put together or quizzes. And that seems to really relate to this generation. So that's just an example that we've seen in the workforce in terms of baby boomers. If we go on to talk about Generation X, as Julian said, they are self-sufficient. They don't like to be micromanaged. We've got an example here where we had an organisation that wanted to run a health and safety certificate. So they took quite a traditional approach, day release, were very structured around when people should do revision, when they should feed back, all that sort of thing. It was very, very structured. And we found a real low level of engagement with that group, which were mainly Generation X people. And we found that a number of them dropped out during this course, and the great majority that remained with it didn't pass the course. So we thought that a lot of that, there were other reasons, but we thought a lot of it was about the structured, too disciplined nature of the course. So we changed it to be more, if you like, coursework based and more an e-learning element, which allowed people to access things when they wanted to, call for help when they wanted to, instead of being very structured about when they had to do things. And the result of that was much higher uptake and a much higher pass rate. So that's just, interesting in the way that you might want to put training across. If we then go on to talk about millennials, which, as we've said, probably represent a high proportion of your workplace. To summarise these again, they've high expectations of employers. They demand a lot, quite rightly, I think. And they're not afraid to question authority. So the example we had here, a company wanted us to do a culture survey to find out what their health and safety culture was like. and they originally talked about a survey, paper or electronic based, filling in some questions. We worked with them and suggested that it might be better to have the people in the room and ask them the questions and allow them to interact back, which is what we did, and it worked much better. We've got 100% uptake. Some of that's because they were there, I guess, and didn't have a choice, but it was we got genuine answers. Unfortunately, the high expectations part, if you don't follow through on what you've asked them, you'll obviously demotivate them, which unfortunately is what happened with this example. So millennials can be quite demanding, but really, really helpful in terms of pushing your company forward. And then if we finish with Generation Z, as we know, this generation are often said to have a short attention span. It might be a different way to think about it, as they're just efficient with their time. They just want to know the stuff that they really need to know, and that's it. So example here is where we've had a company with Generation Z employees wanting them to fill in workplace check sheets but for equipment and traditional paper clipboard approach, and they didn't relate to it at all, didn't want to do it, very difficult. So they switched to a free app they could use, which there are many of those available, and they got a 60% uptake. So they're using their own mobile devices to do a checklist rather than the paper version, and 60% uptake very quickly. And the point to just finish with here is, we know already we have to care for our employees, whether it is legally or morally. So it's up to us to communicate with them in the right way. So it doesn't matter what generation they are, we have to tailor our methods in order to communicate with them properly. Okay, so hopefully that's where we can be useful to the people on the webinar and suggest ways in which we can do this. So if we first of all look at e-learning, now you've heard e-learning all the time, it's bandied around, and it has some positives, some negatives. I think the thing with e-learning is it's flexible. People can access it when they need to. So it's often referred to as pull learning rather than push. Now, if we just think about that with some of the examples I've just mentioned, it's much more effective because you allow people to learn when they want to. So it suits the Generation Z people generally a bit more, but it's certainly an option. So that's e-learning and the push and pull difference. Something we've found certainly very useful, very effective over the last few years is what you might call gamification. So you see an example on the screen here of a simple risk assessment game. So it shows people a factory example, and you go through and you assess different risks that are there. The interesting point here, it isn't about learning risk assessment. You know, it doesn't replace a risk assessment course, but what it does is it gets people talking about it. And so you'll see here, you do the game, you get a score, you can then be classified as things like a risk master or a risk taker on the other end of the spectrum. And what we found is, if this is delivered in the right way, and you'll see a picture here with a league table on, and this is a genuine event where we've asked people to play this game, and then they've got a score, and we've put them on a league table. And now doing that we need to be careful that it's positive. You know, there's a prize for the top person, but really it's about just inspiring people to talk about it. Doesn't make them experts in risk assessment, but if they're around the water cooler in the morning talking about what score they got, then health and safety is on the agenda. So that's some of the gamification element. And then in some ways bringing a lot of this together is the blended learning approach. So you get, as the picture shows there, you get teacher-led learning, so face-to-face, but it's also supported by an online content. And that online content can be gamification, it can be you ask people to go away and do things. And for certain generations, this works very well. But it's sort of a best fit of all the methods we've talked about so far. So we found, again, that is much more successful in many cases than a traditional face-to-face learning element. And they can support each other to a degree. So that's blended learning. But we mustn't forget, of course, that there is always a place for the face-to-face teaching. And to give you an example, if I want to talk about changing the safety culture in my organisation, I'm not going to do it through e-learning. That doesn't work. Because it's an emotional sell, it needs to be face-to-face. But it needs to be engaging. The days of people reading from a PowerPoint presentation or from scripts or whatever it might be in front of people, you know, are gone. It doesn't work. It doesn't show, you know, interaction. So face-to-face learning needs to be inspirational and engaging. So just some other examples we've seen. We can use simple games. This one here is around risk assessment. We've also got sort of hazard spotting exercises that you can see come up there. Very simple stuff, inexpensive, but it really is effective. And the final one here is just around getting out onto the shop floor and doing things. So this is about risk assessment. So you spend a lot of time in the classroom talking about risk assessment. Important to go out and actually practice it. And people are nervous about doing this because you know, it takes up a lot of time. The most expensive resource in terms of training is your people. So if you've got them in a classroom, we really should be making the most of that opportunity and doing things that are interactive and going to inspire people. So that's the last bit there in terms of engaging learning. What we need to be really careful about, and Julian's alluded to it already, is trying to put people in boxes. And there are two problems there. One is that you're unlikely to have a cohort of people that you're delivering to that are just one generation. So you can't just have one method. And equally, just because people are born at a certain time doesn't mean that they have all the attributes of that generation. And so what we would recommend is that you perhaps look at some of the methods we've talked about there, and there are lots of others, and design programs that vary the methods and think about the audience and deliver to what's going to inspire them. We're moving away from ticking a box, we've done some training, into really making it a value-added experience. Okay, so at that point, I'll hand back to Jenny for our next poll.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, so for our second poll, we would like to look at how that's reflected in your business and how you currently deliver health and safety training. Is it all face-to-face or classroom, all e-learning, or is it both face-to-face and e-learning, or do you not deliver any health and safety training? Just a couple more moments to give everybody a chance to contribute. That's great, thank you. So let's see what those results look like. Really interesting, Chris. So 3/4 of the audience deliver by both face-to-face and e-learning. 18% deliver all by face-to-face or classroom-based learning, and 9% do it through e-learning. So a good strong mix there, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. I think, first of all, the important thing to say is that we're not getting anyone saying they don't do any health and safety training, so that's really important. And the other bits there is strong, you know, 3/4 of people saying face-to-face and e-learning, so there's a good mix there. And then there's you can see the numbers with the other two. I think the thing to say is that if we talk about the 74% face-to-face and e-learning, what we need to just consider is that these two things complement each other. We don't need to be saying we need to do this via e-learning and this face-to-face. And people talk about blended all the time, but combining the things is a really effective method we found, certainly over the last few years. So yeah, it's interesting. It's good to know that people are using all the methods that are there.
Great, thanks Chris, thanks Jenny. Chris has made some excellent points there around having this blended flexible approach, about making it fun, and about elements like gamification that can engage people. I think it's important to think that we take this and expand it out from just learning and apply it to our overall approach to health and safety across our organisations. When we consider engagement with our teams, one of the important areas to consider is just simply the perception of health and safety. And let me sort of put a question out there for you to think about, which is, how do people react when you tell them that you work in health and safety? And generally, there can be a rolling of the eyes. The thought of anoraks normally comes into mind, and sometimes we're actually the thought police. So we're just here to enforce rules. And if I did a word association with people and talked about health and safety, the kind of things we're going to get are high-vis, hard hats and clipboards. But again, we need to think about, how does this actually appeal to our fastest growing cohort of employees? And I'd suggest that actually often it doesn't. Now, when we think about this and align it to the world that our people live in, we think about that. They live in a fast-moving world, it's high-tech and it's gadget-driven. If we then start to ask them to do health and safety on pieces of paper, this is just another way of disengaging them. If people perceive it as dull and boring, they're simply not going to engage. So we need to be more engaging, we need to be more creative with our approach to health and safety. Regardless of age, we have a legal and a moral duty to protect our people from the start of their employment, at induction, and then on an ongoing basis. Equally, our people have a moral and a legal duty around their own and their colleagues' health and safety. So we do need to work really hard to engage them and help them to both follow process and work in a safe manner. Another key part of this then is it comes from leadership, and it comes from visible leadership, where anybody who is managing a team or managing people should be actively promoting safety and talking about health and safety and compliance. So we can think here about how we can use tools like safety tours to encourage leadership dialogue around safety and breed behaviour where our leaders just naturally and openly talk about safety in all of the activities that they get involved with to engage that broader workforce. And what we're trying to do here is just drive conversations and drive good two-way conversations where people feel that their voice is heard and their voice is valued. So what we should look at is, what are the tools that we can use that allow this feedback and suggestions? We've attended various conferences and seminars this year, and there's been a lot of discussion around this, with a real focus on how we start to get better at taking ideas from all levels of a business and giving people the tools to put forward those ideas so that we can drive change and also continuous improvement. And an important element when we're thinking about those tools is that they just must be simple and easy to access and to use. Again, if we're going to tap into the expectations of, I'm not going to talk about one generation here, but most generations now, it's that I can pull a device out of my pocket and I can easily use a web page or I can use an app to do something. And most of us do that with everyday activities in our personal lives now. So safety needs to be mobile, and it needs to be really simple and easy to use. So to finish off with, what we'd like to do today is very briefly look at how technology can support this drive for engagement, and think about the points we've talked about, how it can be utilized by leaders, but also be simple and easy to use across the different generations. To start with, I'm going to talk about mobile. So here's an example of how the software system can be accessed using mobile devices. So it could be a smartphone, a tablet, but here we can have tailored forms that anybody can access to actually voice things or voice observations around safety. So if somebody, for example, wants to report a hazard, they can come into here and they can access a form. And what you'll notice is we've tried to make it really simple and really visually appealing. So if I click on report a hazard, simple and easy, ask me to start a form, I can delve into my organizational structure and define where that hazard was observed. So I can drop that in. I can say who's reported it. So in this case, it's me. And then as I go on down, I've got simple tools to make it really simple and quick to fill the form out. So I can fill the form out simply and easily. And again, what we can do is have predefined forms in here, which just means that it's quick, it's easy, and it's simple. And if we hit those things, it makes it more likely that people are going to engage. So very simply, I can fill the form out. If I'm using a smartphone or a tablet, I can then tap into my camera roll. I'm actually on my desktop today, so I'm going into my pictures here. But again, the power here is that people can add attachments or photographs, and we get that great supporting evidence of the things that people have seen. So we engage with our workforce through making it really simple and really easy to do. But again, if we think about the culture that people live in, it means they can pull their smartphone out of their pocket, and it aligns to the way that they live their lives outside of the workplace. When we think about our leadership, there's no difference really. We work in the same way. We provide them with tools that make it easy for them to be great leaders around health and safety and around compliance. So one of the examples here is that we can create what we call leadership tours. And if I go into one, which I prepared earlier, just to show you an example of the look and feel of this, this allows any of our leaders, managers or supervisors, when they're with a team or an area, to go around and to look at observations and look at specific areas of the job or the activity and say what was being done in a safe manner and anything that was being done in an unsafe manner. And again, these are tailored to your organization, so it fits your unique requirements. So if we take a look at tools and equipment, it's looking at some simple questions. Were they right for the job? Were they being used correctly? And here we can put a simple number in of safe against unsafe. Now, what all this does then is starts to drive a great flow of information. So if we engage with our different generations, we make it simple and easy for them, whether they're on the shop floor or whether they're in leadership, it drives a great flow of data that we can then use across our organization to actually make informed decisions about our future strategy around health and safety. So for example, what training and what education are we going to get involved with? And again, in terms of that information, we can then visualize it in a really nice and stimulating way that appeals to different teams, different areas and different generations. So if we think about those leadership tours, I can start to see here which areas, which teams have actually carried out leadership tours. So I can see that across my different departments. If I scroll on down, I can then see which of my leaders have completed any leadership tours. So again, going back to Chris's earlier point around gamification, we can start to do that in the general approach to health and safety. So here we can have some league tables around which of our leaders are most active in leadership tours. We then get some really compelling information, because what we can see is we can start to see the number of safe against unsafe observations. So green is good, red is development areas. And if I scroll on down, we can start to look at that across the sections of those leadership tours and then into the specific questions here. So for example, I can see my peaks around documentation. Got a couple of questions around documentation, and those are my highest spikes on red. So what that tells me is that we can start to go and look at that in more detail, and we can start to coach and educate people around improving performance with or the use of documentation. Now at that point, I'm going to hand back to Jenny, and we're going to see if we've had any questions as we've been running through the webinar.
Thanks, Julian. Yes, thank you, and thank you to Chris for that great content. Yes, we have had some questions coming in, and we try to get through as many of them as we can. So our first question is, we aren't allowed to have technology on our shop floor, so how can we use technology to engage our shop floor staff?
Shall I pick that up, Chris? That's a good question. It's a question that comes up fairly regularly. Some people have this approach because of sort of intellectual property, others for safety reasons. Commonly what we find is that in that situation, organisations will set up either kiosks in areas or break rooms so that people can go and access the system in a secure area, or sometimes they even have tablets that will, company tablets that will be issued out and then obviously brought back in, or simply having tablets in a secure container in a specific area on the shop floor, so anybody can go and make an observation or report something at a simple point within the workplace.
Thanks, Julian. That's helpful. So for our next question, I think it might maybe another common question. So it's about getting buy-in from the business to use technology for health and safety. And how do you achieve that when you've got a business's resistance to supporting such advancements in health and safety management?
I'll quickly give my thoughts on that, Julian.
Yep.
I think what we need to, and I briefly mentioned it on the webinar, I think what it's good to appreciate is where the money you spend on training and engagement with employees is going. The biggest cost you'll have is the people that you're asking to either attend a training session or to give up their time to fill a form in, whatever it might be. And so the investment in technology is the smaller part of it, really. I mean, if we really get down to it and start to think about the technology, in most cases it's inexpensive when compared to the benefit that it actually delivers. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing is to explain those benefits to whoever's making the decision about the spend. Hopefully we've given some evidence today of how to link to other generations, or to the different generations, but we've got to start using technology to deliver effective training or other interventions. Otherwise the money spent on it just becomes a waste and you have to keep repeating things. So I don't know if you want to say a bit more on that one, Julian.
I think I probably concur with what you're saying there, Chris. I think we commonly would look at things like a return on investment when we're looking at the application of technology. So we start to look at where it can drive efficiencies across your organisation. But also I think, like you say, Chris, it's that education of the senior leadership teams around the sort of just the value of driving better engagement. And one of the challenges we've kind of put out there is to talk to leadership about other areas of the business and the technology and systems that are being used there, because commonly it's way ahead of the health and safety teams. So I think there's a challenge there in terms of we need to be aligned as an organisation in terms of our approach with technology across different disciplines.
Thanks both. So another question that we've had in, the response is great to have all of the tools, but there's concerns about how they could actually then get the workforce to use them. So things like gamification and the e-learning resources.
Okay, so I think just from experience, it is a challenge, obviously. From experience, what we've found is that there's two things really. One is a really effective launch. Quite often we've seen examples anyway where things are launched and they're not launched particularly well. The reasons behind things aren't explained, and I think that is really that's one of the starting points. I think, as we've sort of said through there and talked about different generations, it's important to get their feedback. And I know that's a very obvious thing to say, but you're explaining how something's going to be launched and let the employees have a say as to how they think it would best work. As I say, rather an obvious thing to say, but it works. And then the other thing is monitoring it. If people don't uptake the technology that's there, we need to have some sort of metric to measure that and feedback and identify why. Where these things really go wrong is they're launched badly, they're not tracked, and surprisingly in 12 months time no one's using them, and they're therefore seen as a waste of money, and we never do that again. So launch and continual monitoring, I think, is important.
All good points, Chris, and I think the only thing I would add is probably to create champions across the business. So engage people from different teams, different departments in the decision making process around the technology. Involve them heavily in the sort of the initial training, so that they can go out and they can promote it and be ambassadors in the different teams to drive the uptake of technology.
Thanks, Julian. I think
that's Julian. Sorry, Jen. Just a quick one. I mean, it is surprising. You can look at technology and it looks very, very expensive, but it is surprising how affordable some of these things are, and they're just becoming cheaper all the time. So, you know, have a look at them as well, and look at the price. You might be surprised.
Thanks, Chris. Indeed, yes. So I think that's a good place to stop. We have run out of time for this morning's session. I think the key thing there for the questions is be creative with how you do it and how you implement it as well. So thank you again to Chris and to yourself, Julian, and thank you all for your time this morning. This webinar is one of a series that we are running as part of our partnership with She Software. We have worked together to develop a totally new way to manage health and safety that combines technology and management tools with our team of experts to offer a holistic support for businesses. We developed, as Chris mentioned, the solutions that meet the risk and budget profiles for businesses both large and small. So if you're interested in finding out more about what we're doing together and the new ways to deliver health and safety management in your business that we can help you with, please do let us know in the survey at the end of the webinar. You can keep in touch with Make Business and She Software at our social media accounts and on our website. So thanks again to our speakers. Their contact details are available throughout this on the slides, so please do feel free to contact them if you need more information. Once again, thank you for joining us this morning, and we hope you can join us again soon.